Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event. My name is Shannon French, and I'm the director of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence here at Case Western Reserve University. And we are delighted to have some distinguished panelists with us here this evening to discuss topics that concern us all as we look to the future and how the technology that we live with may possibly come to define us more or less than we want. So before we begin, I'd like to tell you a bit about each of our panelists, and then I will be directing some questions to them myself, the moderator's prerogative, but then we will open the floor, and any of you who have questions can chime in, and we have folks that can run over with a microphone so we can hear you all. We are filming the event behind you there. So when you stand up, if you are comfortable doing so, you're welcome to state your name and your affiliation. But if you're not, that's also fine. So to tell you about our panelists, I'm going to start furthest from me here with my Case Western Reserve colleague. This is Kijun Lee. And Professor Kijun Lee is the Nord Distinguished Assistant Professor in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering here at Case Western Reserve University. And her research area is in distributed intelligence and robotics, including sensor networked systems, swarm robots, novel robotic mechanism design, and human-robot interaction. She directs the Distributed Intelligence and Robotics Laboratory, which facilitates research and hands-on educational activities for both our graduate and our undergraduate students. Her research has been funded by NSF, National Academy's Keck Futures Initiative, Clinical and Translational Science Collaborative in Cleveland, and VA APT Center in Cleveland. Professor Lee earned her MS and PhD in mechanical engineering from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, and her BSE in electrical and electronics engineering in Seoul, Korea. Thank you for joining us. Our next speaker is Dr. Susana Rose. Susana Rose joined the professional staff at the Cleveland Clinic in 2011, and she is currently the Associate Chief Experience Officer and Director of Research in the Office of Patient Experience. She is an assistant professor at the Cleveland Clinic's Lerner College of Medicine, and again here at Case Western and in the Department of Bioethics. I'll also note that she is a member of the Inamori Center's Advisory Board. She is also an instructor at Harvard University's Chan School of Public Health, where she teaches health ethics. She received her PhD from Harvard University's Health Policy Program with a concentration in ethics in 2010. Prior to her doctoral studies, she earned an MS in bioethics from Union College Albany Medical Center in 2006 and an MS in social work from Columbia University in 1998. Dr. Rose worked as a clinical social worker and researcher at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City. Her publications have appeared in high-ranked peer-reviewed journals such as JAMA, I almost corrected that to JME, which is the Journal of Military Ethics. Sorry for my own bias. JAMA, JAMA, Internal Medicine, Journal of General Internal Medicine, the Journal of Clinical Oncology, the New England Journal of Medicine, and PLOS1, and her book chapters on health policy ethics and end-of-life care have been published by Oxford University Press. Her current research focuses on the ethics of AI and the ethics of transparency, patient experience, and testing the impact of innovations in technology, communication, and end-of-life care on health outcomes and patient satisfaction. These areas of research have been generously funded by multiple funding sources, including Harvard University's Safra Center for Ethics, NIH's Clinical and Translational Science Collaborative at the Cleveland Clinic and Case Western Reserve University, and the Greenwall Foundation. Thank you for joining us. And last but certainly not least, I will introduce to you Admiral Kibun. Admiral Margaret Kibun in her final active duty assignment in the Navy, was the U.S. Navy's 26th Chief of Chaplains, serving as the Director of Religious Ministry for the Department of the Navy and advising the Secretary of the Navy, the Chief of Naval Operations, and Commandant of the Marine Corps, as well as the Commandant of the Coast Guard, on all matters pertaining to religion in their respective services. Prior to that assignment, Rear Admiral Kibun served as the 18th Chaplain of the Marine Corps. A native of Washington, Pennsylvania, Margaret Kibun earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from Goucher College, Towson, Maryland, and her Master of Divinity and Doctor of Ministry degrees from Princeton Theological Seminary, Princeton, New Jersey, as well as a master's degree in National Security and Strategic Studies from the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Dr. Kibun served as a senior fellow at the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. Dr. Kibun has over 20 years of senior executive experience leading and managing a 2,500-member global workforce, serving as a strategic-level advisor to the Department of Defense, ensuring constitutional protections for religious diversity, providing guidance to leadership regarding the spiritual health of the force and the religious impact on military operations and diplomatic relations. And her background reflects a proven history of visionary expertise in ethical leader development, religious accommodation, and spiritual advisement. Presently, Dr. Kibun serves on the Board of Trustees for the Princeton Theological Seminary, our Board of Advisors for the Inamori Center, and the Marine Corps Scholarship Foundation Board. She is a member of the Veterans and Military Advisory Committee for the Washington National Academy. Please join me in welcoming Margaret. So now that you know who our speakers are, you can see why they were chosen to address these topics here tonight. And I hope as we open our conversation that you will let your own questions percolate in your mind so that when I open it to the floor, you will be able to jump in with the questions that you have. We're going to start off in the middle here with Susana, if I may. There's a lot of enthusiasm for incorporating AI in the fields of medicine and health. However, we know there have been some public missteps as well. For example, there was IBM's Watson for Oncology, which was rejected by doctors for giving bad or even dangerous treatment recommendations. An issue, incidentally, that IBM blamed on the doctors that trained the system. As a bioethicist, where do you see positive promise for integrating AI into the health and medical arena, and what raises red flags for you?
So thank you, Shannon. Thank you for having me here. I absolutely love coming that big 1 mile down the street. Seems like a huge journey, but yet it's so close. So what I think is fascinating about the IBM Watson oncology example, and I'm going to just briefly discuss what it is so we are all on the same page. So the IBM Watson oncology was really a very highly publicized use of artificial intelligence, or what I'll say AI, in the healthcare domain. And specifically, it was a partnership between Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York City, which you may have remembered. I spent about a decade there. And was housed essentially to use the expertise of the oncologists and the surgeons at Memorial Sloan Kettering, which is arguably one of the largest and best cancer hospitals in the United States. And use that knowledge to then train an artificial intelligence, using machine learning to integrate what they knew about patients. So they put in patient data. They also put in hypothetical data, which I'll get to in a minute. And they also put in research findings and research data into this machine to try to determine what would be the best treatment for particular patients who have a certain disease makeup. And so putting in a lot of variables in which theoretically a human mind or a human doctor might not be able to determine in order to determine the best case for that patient. But one of the concerns that was raised was that some of the treatment recommendations seemed maybe a little bit to the left of center, and sometimes may have even been dangerous. So for example, suggesting a blood thinner for a patient with a blood disorder where that might have been dangerous. Now, from what I understand, there were no reported outcomes of harm, unless somebody else knows about this. It was more of a theoretical concern about the results that were coming. I think what's also important about this whole scenario is that the research there was very little research done on before this was actually deployed and actually bought by many other healthcare systems. There wasn't a systematic, structured research that was done on the AI incorporation in the healthcare system. So perhaps some of these challenges might have been identified before the product was marketed. I think the final thing that is fascinating about this is also the use of data and how data, and I think we'll get into that a little bit later too, Shannon, so I won't spend too much time on this. But some people criticize the training of this because the people who were doing the training, and I'm sure my colleagues will verify this too, is that when you're training in a model, you have to have labeled data and you have to be able to determine the outcomes and then train the mechanisms to be able to assess based on those labeled data. And so if you are making those determinations by a very small group of clinicians, even if they're the best theoretically in the world, that might be a biased source of training of these data. So for example, other countries, other scientists and other physicians actually said that they disagreed with some of the recommendations that may have been made, arguably by some of this great group of physicians. And you also might wonder, the data that was actually used. Sloan Kettering is a very specific hospital system, and the type of data and the type of patients that go there might not be representative of not only the United States, but certainly the world. And so we think about how these data are being used, are they representative, and also how are the data being trained? I think these are all important issues for healthcare. Finally, even though I sound a little pessimistic about the lessons that IBM Watson Oncology gives us, I have gotten very interested in the use of AI and how it might benefit in healthcare. And we can talk about that a little bit later, but I do see some really interesting benefits. First is the area of diagnostic assistance, what I like to call augmented intelligence. So it's the use of artificial intelligence and humans, such as radiologists, that combine together to produce even better results than each of the systems individually. I think what's also fascinating, not only the diagnostic area, but is also looking at healthcare outcomes for large populations of people. In the United States, we see transitions in payer systems and health policy that is not only paid on how individuals fare, but also on how groups, what we call population health. And so AI might be very helpful in combining many thousands of data sets and also thousands of variables to determine where we might go. Lastly, allocation of healthcare systems. So even within healthcare systems and across healthcare systems, AI might be quite valuable in knowing which patients might be best served in certain environments, more than perhaps an individual person or a group of people combining those data on their own. So that's where I see the three areas where AI in healthcare might, at least initially, be most helpful.
Thank you. And I think we will have to return both to the data question, but also this language of augmented intelligence instead of just artificial intelligence, and what that can do to assist human beings and possibly shore up some of their natural weaknesses. That's intriguing. This one I'm going to direct to Kijun, if I may. So you have developed, and you continue to design, some amazing robots, including some that were inspired by origami shapes. Where do you see the most promise for positive ethical use of this kind of innovative technology? Do you worry about future uses of your technology that might not align with your personal ethics, such as for weaponry? As an engineer, are there things that you can do within the R&D process to make it less likely that your creations could be used one day for harm rather than good?
Sure. Thank you for great questions. And I see great positive impact that AI brought to our society. So first of all, it has been used for various applications, including assistive technologies that can help people with disabilities. I was talking about prosthetic devices that can help people walk or use those arms again or hands again. There is surgical robots that is now like pretty widely used, that is proven to reduce the operation time and thus reduces the time of like hospitalization and time for recovery. So that has like tremendous cost benefits as well. And also in particular, so the AI is becoming more important because of the personalization of the technologies. In old days, we were just automating certain tasks that people don't want to do it, or it's too dangerous to be done by humans. But now it's kind of becoming a part of our life. You want to make the AI to adapt to you rather than you adapting to the technologies. Because in old days, you have to learn how to use computers. You have to learn the programming languages to do it. But now my 5-year-old daughter talk to Siri and play the music that she wants. So the way that the different generations interacting with technology changes through the advancement of AI. So I see a lot of positive impact, in particular for those things that we can actually change in a positive ways. In particular, when you think about like aging population or those people with disabilities, technology can do the work that people may not be able to provide. So I see a great positive impact in our society.
That's wonderful. I'm sitting here, or rather standing here, with a bum ankle and possibly staring down surgery. And so I was listening to that part going, good, this sounds good. And I can also relate to the idea of the younger generations being digital natives and being so comfortable with all of this technology. I remember when my daughter was, barely a toddler, when she wanted something bigger, she always went like that. She thought she could make it go bigger because it should. And so the technology adapts to us. Now, I am going to just press you on one point. You didn't speak about the concern about weaponry, but I know we've had some offline brief conversation. I like to worry people about that. Do you have any thoughts about whether your work could ever be taken that direction?
That's true. So one of my research topics is in swarm robotics. So I'm going to start a new research project probably within a month or so with the DARPA funding. So we're going to actually work on the swarm algorithms that can work with the military personnel for the urban military missions under kind of destroyed infrastructure with like a limited wireless communication and those things, how you can make sure those military personnel stays safe and then perform search and rescue type of purposes and also identify potential hazard. So AI plays a great role, and also the robots are a special form of AI that has the physical kind of autonomy with the software that can perform the intelligent task together. In particular, in swarm robotics, that has a great potential for those applications, but depending on who uses it, it could be really good, it could be really bad. Whether I can embed any research and development process to kind of implement certain features to guarantee the safety or ethical use, I cannot answer that. So I do not have any way to incorporate that one. So that is kind of our society to address as a kind of policymakers and all those people who have to bring these topics up and discuss further. As an engineer, I do not have an answer yet.
Well, that is a fair answer, though, and I think what also brings up is the role of those of us who do work specifically in the field of ethics, the responsibility that we have to ask these questions and to get a seat at the table to ask these questions. I was also saying on the break before we started that I have been asked some of these questions about DARPA projects at various times because they always have an element called ELSI, which is the ethical, legal, and social implications of the work that they're doing. And the opportunity to weigh in that kind of ELSI side of the research is something that I and many others who work in these fields take very seriously, to be that voice where you sometimes can't be.
Sure.
So being able to take that role. Let's move over to Margaret now. Now, this is something that I've also been very following very closely, very aware of, given my interest in military ethics. There has been quite a push happening lately for the DoD to design and deploy advanced AI in the military. In fact, some people have even talked about an AI arms race. This could be amongst countries like our own, the US, and China and Russia, for example. This causes concern to many. Anytime you talk about an arms race, it brings up some bad memories, of course. And And there's been much discussion about both the fact that AI itself may not simply be advanced enough, let alone infallible, as some people imagine, and the issue of the importance of keeping human beings firmly in charge of life and death decisions. As a former military chaplain, what hopes or worries do you have about the future use of AI by the military?
Dr. French, Shannon, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here. And given the fact that this particular session was scheduled for 2 days where there were weather challenges, I'm wondering if AI isn't fighting its own battle with Mother Nature. When you talk about the design and execution, the deployment of AI in any setting, as most of you know, it boils down to two things. You could probably extrapolate to many, but I believe it's just two, and that's control and value. Addressing these factors is only complicated when you start factoring in things like social norms, the intention of the user, the country in this case, with widely differing moral frameworks, and what is the end game? What's the intention that people are setting out in the utilization of artificial intelligence? And it's critical in the case for things like China and Russia to understand that they come with different agendas than perhaps we have. And those agendas have to be considered. With respect to values, it boils down to this question: whose values? And that comes at an individual level as well as the global scale. We in the United States have measured our battlefield assessment, things like our crisis action decision-making, our overarching engagement strategy. All of those things are based on the principles of just war. That's the moral framework on which we have built all of our equipment to include our artificial intelligence. Assuming we maintain that ethic in our own design and utilization of artificial intelligence in combat operations, can we count on our adversaries to hold the same value set that we do? And on what moral framework does that country base its decisions? When you talk about things like rules of engagement, what we understand to have contributed to the development of those rules, the establishment of those rules, has everybody else bought into the same thing? So it's at the very basic nature of any engagement from one country to the next, but it's only extrapolated that much further when you start factoring in things like artificial intelligence. As for artificial intelligence specifically, as you all have indicated, and Dr. French has put in a number of her articles, the GIGO principle still applies. The garbage being, in this case, the moral code that is built into an intelligence system. Human fallibility is extrapolated at the speed of Moore's law. And when you're putting that into artificial intelligence, you don't know what you're going to get as you talk about who's placed in that construction. But there's a second question that I think we also need to ask, and that is, can morality be coded? Can you, in fact, program morality? There are some factors which I believe are clearly defined, and you probably very well could put them into some sort of algorithm. But I would argue the thing that makes humans human is the soul. The intangible factor that allows humans to remain aware, not just to the nuances of a situation, what's happening, the dynamism of that which is taking place around them, but also the moral implications of an action. Things that enable us to preserve the virtues of love and hope and kindness. That's, I think, where we're going with respect to Dr. Lee's question. How do you know that when I intended it to go this way, that when it's laid out there, that those unintended consequences aren't going to start reaping hazard into what we had really hoped for good? Regarding the second half of the question, the issue of control, in other words, what about our adversaries? The issue of control is at the center of the concern. As a chaplain, pastor, I often wonder if humans really are in charge of life and death decisions. But theological debate aside, I realize tends to be more of a science conversation. When we give up our responsibility to keep the safety on either the literal or the figurative trigger of any kind of weaponry, then we exceed our agency. That is our responsibility to preserve those same values. So there you have it. That's my thoughts.
These are great thoughts. I love that question. Can morality be coded? That is a wonderful question. And of course, I always like it as a military ethicist when people invoke just war tradition. This makes me happy. But I take your point as well about garbage in, garbage out. And how do we see that in this context? And how do we ensure also what might be going into these systems from our enemies, which is a problem we know has gone on since there has been conflict. So all of that is very worrisome, whilst it is also intriguing. So I have a question now that I'm actually going to frame to all of you, and then we'll let you duke it out. No, you can then answer all of you one at a time. And I think this is because it applies to all of your fields. It applies to everything that you work on. There's been a lot of research to suggest that human beings tend to defer to automated systems, even when those systems are known to create errors and to be capable of great mistakes. People using them have the training to know better, and yet they don't trust themselves over the machines. This is sometimes called automation bias. So in your various fields, do you see signs of automation bias, and how concerned are you about it? Do you think this phenomenon, if it exists, might start to fade as people become more used to automated systems and no longer see them as mysterious black boxes that probably know more than we do? I think, for example, of, in my own case, a very simple rudimentary system, my GPS that I count on. When I am going somewhere unfamiliar, I am wedded to every turn that it tells me. But if I'm somewhere that I know well, I will, laugh off my GPS and well, that's a stupid way to go. I'm going to go this way. So my own familiarity changes my approach. But we have seen these very worrisome studies that suggest that people who even have experience will still defer to that automated voice, if you will. Which of you would like to tackle that first?
I will. I really like the Google Map image because there is a dependency that we sort of create on this idea. I watched a woman today, I am not kidding you, as we were driving in with the taxi. She was driving and she went and made a left turn on a one-way street, and everybody was coming the opposite direction. And the taxi driver says, "Doesn't everybody have GPS now?" And even if they do, my question is, do they use it? Maybe they depend on it too much. But that being said, I think that it's human nature. This is where you're getting my perspective from my background. It's human nature. Aside from finding the chance for healthy competition, we are quick to defer to others who appear to be better, smarter, more important than ourselves, right? And the reasons for that range anywhere from lack of self-esteem to laziness. I mean, this is part of the human condition. It's a natural inclination, but it also applies in our response to automated systems as well. What I think we miss in this acquiescence, as well as in any unhealthy competition, is that we lose sight of our individual talents, our individual skills, those which I would call our gifts, which are unique to each person, but which, when included and incorporated one with the other, contribute to the overall well-being of humanity. This is where I think Dr. Rose was going with her understanding of the augmentation, the human, the individual augmentation. You used one phrase. I have another phrase in my notes here I'm going to refer to. You talked about it, augmented intelligence. It's also intelligence augmentation. There are other theorists who are talking about this. If we look at intelligence as augmenting who we are uniquely as human beings, then I think we capture the whole picture, and we don't lose sight of the fact that individually we have very specific skills, very specific gifts.
Susanna, please
Yeah,
jump in.
so I'm going to agree with you and disagree with you. I'm not so sure about human nature, because I don't think I want to comment on that. But I do disagree with you about the background of why this automation bias exists. So I don't think it's low self-esteem, and I don't think it's laziness, particularly in a lot of areas of healthcare. So in healthcare, we see this a lot because we have a lot of Epic and Allscripts and a whole bunch of other what we call electronic medical records that many of our clinicians use. And because of a lot of the data that are coming at most of our clinicians, we have developed what we call there's a lot of different ways, clinical decision support tools, and which might suggest a certain prescription or something for a certain patient based on information that's provided on their medical record and on known treatments for that particular disease. But what we see, though, is that with quite a few studies, is that clinicians will do exactly as you said. I'm not so sure it's due to laziness or self-esteem, but because the recommendation will be made, they will often follow it. And so there have been a lot of studies in trying to deviate from this default system that humans tend to play into. So we said alerts go up, we have a red sign, and a whole bunch of things we've been trying to accomplish. As well as reducing workload. Because if people are in a hurry, they also tend to be more likely to make these errors and go with what the system suggests. So what I suggest is that we do deal with this in healthcare. We don't have a different human nature than the rest of the world. But I'm not convinced, though, that I've seen yet how we can entirely get beyond this. What we might want to look at, though, is the counterfactual of life without these support tools. So if you're looking at sort of a purely sort of outcomes, utilitarian sort of analysis, in general, having these decision support tools does lead to better outcomes and recommendations compared to those who are not. So even though we do have, and this is a rough estimation, there are differences with different types of recommendation tools. So, but we don't know how to completely overcome this yet.
One thing that I have explored in the military context, but I don't know if it would work as well in the medical context, is to focus on systems that simply don't give a single answer. In other words, they only ever give at least two choices. Do you think there's some possibility there that you could avoid that automation bias if you still force the individual to make a decision?
That's absolutely possible in the sense because I think that forces somebody to make some kind of decision. But the problem is that we sometimes, given the data that go in, there might be possibility of several different decisions in certain scenarios. But in healthcare, especially if you're plugging in a lot of data, there might be some higher level certainty. So with these systems, we not only develop a probability or essentially a coefficient, we often have a confidence interval, right, that's also playing into this. So we not only need to develop our systems to say, okay, well, this person's 75% chance and 74% chance in this. Those might be reasonable things to choose against. But what is a meaningful difference between the two? This is where we start to get into some really interesting gray areas. Because if you give a choice between two different options and one is 10% a probability better, but the confidence interval, you see where I'm heading.
Absolutely.
So to give almost a false choice between two things that might not actually be so equivalent, I think that also has some ethical problems.
Absolutely. Intriguing. Kijun, would you like to jump in here?
Yeah, I actually wanted to give a very specific example of automation bias
Oh,
and then
wonderful.
how the training can work. So I teach a class called Computers in Mechanical Engineering. So in that course, basically teaches like you have a mathematical models of physical systems or real world problems modeled into mathematical format. And our goal is to basically to teach students how to use computers to solve it. So by doing so at the beginning, so when you use an Excel or a calculator, you barely doubt your solution, right? So that is one of the automation bias. Whenever you calculate, you feel like the number is a little bit too high or too small, but since it is calculated, it must be true. We do the same for using the computers, so it can do a little bit more like complex calculations than a small size the calculator. But basically, you program things, and then your computer. So there are like mathematical tools that you can put those equations, and then it gives you a numerical solution. Numerical solutions are approximated solution, not the analytical ones. So often not an exact solution, and because computers can only kind of use finite numbers, but there exist infinite numbers that we do handle with. So those kind of things, those students at the beginning, they do not understand. They use the built-in functions in the program so they can solve it. But they do not understand that could be wrong. But through the classes, basically, we try to educate the students to learn what's behind of that built-in functions. So how it is calculated and what is the outcomes, and then what is the limitations of that one. So then the students understand the limitations of those built-in functions of that software. Then they can actually make their own judgment, or this method is not appropriate to solve this kind of problems, and they apply different numerical techniques. So that is some of those examples of very simple automation and bias of calculations. But by knowing the system and then understanding the limitations and then the actual what's behind that black box, then that allows the engineers or anybody to make a better decision and then basically kind of identify what's wrong and then what could be correct. So that is some kind of one specific example of how you can train people to know better about the limitations of the technology so that you can actually make better use of it.
Yeah, I love that idea. And I'm also, as a philosopher, I'm drawn to the idea of being able to get inside that black box in various ways, but also to ask questions. And I think as we think about the future development of any kind of artificial intelligence, the ability to ask it why it did something and get a response back so you can start to understand. So if it tells you should not go that direction, and you could say, why? Is there traffic? Is there this? Why are you trying to not have me go that way? And then it helps you make a more informed decision. But you have to be taught to ask those kind of questions and to be that kind of a critical thinker. And I love the idea of your students sort of, but I used the system. Why didn't it work? It's harder than that. Yeah, this must be. I bet you have that conversation quite a lot. Yeah. All right, I'm going to now, a similar kind of topic, but slightly different. Say a bit more about bias, and this one is to you again, Susana, because I know this happens quite a lot in your field, although we may find in others as well. That in addition to the one we just discussed, automation bias, the other big concern that people have around this area is the concern around bias permeating algorithms, the things that drive the AI systems. So a fairly well-known example of this involves a beauty contest that was held where AI was supposedly going to select the winners in some super objective way, much better than human judges could, and therefore establish a universal standard of beauty. That was the project, and it was set up by this online company called Beauty AI, I believe. But none of you, I think, since you laughed, you will not be shocked to hear how this turned out. The people in charge of the machine learning in that case, it turned out, had, of course, only shown the system images that they thought were beauty. So predictably, the system just amplified their inherent bias and only spat out the images that they thought were beautiful. There was nothing remotely objective about it. So bias is a big concern, we know, in bioethics and certainly in patient care. Can you tell us more about the kind of issues that AI raises in terms of fair treatment for patients?
So yes, it's an excellent question. And I want to piggyback a little bit more on the story with Beauty AI, because it wasn't just, I say just, a perception of beauty, right? Mm-hmm. What ended up happening was that certain racial groups were considered more attractive than others. Mm-hmm. And so we start to deepen the story about how you can imagine this might pertain over to healthcare. And we also see that it's not just beauty, but there's also other examples from other companies. I don't think this is a one company issue, right? Where we see certain racial groups not even designated as human, for example, designated as an animal as opposed to being human, or racial groups that are for facial recognition software, where it is less likely to be accurate for women and for minority groups, particularly for women of color. And so we start to see the same issues going on with not only with how these data play out, but also how the model is actually being trained and developed. This has relevance to healthcare.
Sorry.
Are you okay?
Healthcare. My cane just fell over.
Relevance to healthcare and healthcare disparities, and also health disparities. And why I say this is that there are several different concerns we have with the data that might be perpetuating or even increasing healthcare disparities. On the flip side, we might be able to use the same models to actually diminish them. So this is where we might be able to play and think about this strategically. So in the data process, we have to make sure that the data are unbiased. So as you might be aware of, there are a lot of disparities in the United States currently in our healthcare system. And not only do certain groups of people have worse health outcomes, they have worse access to healthcare. This creates several different problems. First of all, they might be underrepresented in the data sets. Secondly, they might have worse outcomes. So if we're training models that say a certain group of people have worse outcomes, for instance, based on organ transplant or chemotherapy or ICU admission, then the model might say, oh, well, that person actually is less likely to benefit, therefore the model doesn't recommend this treatment. You might see this being perpetuated. You also have the possibility, what I brought up before with the IBM Watson oncology example, that certain people who are training the system have certain beliefs of what is better and what is worse. And this brings in my perception from the patient experience world, is that what we don't often have are these stakeholders who are potentially affected by this at the table in terms of looking at what these data, how they are put in, what the data represent, and also the values that are being put on what is a good outcome and what is not. This is where I go back to this labeled data. So many times we say cure, not cure. Well, that might be pretty clear. However, if you notice in healthcare, we're having, for example, in oncology, we're having more of a system where you're living with a disease, and therefore potentially subjective outcomes by patients are actually the endpoints that we hope to achieve. And this is where I have some worries in terms of how we're actually determining the better, worse, good, bad outcomes, that we have to have stakeholder engagement in order to define those. And currently, I don't see that occurring. One of my big concerns in healthcare, and maybe this is not the case in defense, but in healthcare, AI, robots, these things are fancy and awesome. And healthcare administrators are really, I think, either afraid of it because they think AI is going to take over doctors and there aren't going to be any more doctors. The robots are going to provide all the healthcare. And then the other side is a sort of, I think it's going to be great, and I think it's going to be horrible on one side, and it's going to be great on the other. It's going to solve all of our problems in healthcare. We're not going to have any predictive uncertainty. Well, obviously, we know that probably neither of these cases are accurate. But where I see in healthcare, we don't have a whole, as the clinician and as an ethicist, I think there's a whole lot of education that needs to be delivered to the people that are leading in our systems. Because we deal with life and death, just like in the defense industry. But I also think that there's a technology bias that sometimes occurs, particularly in healthcare in the United States. Our entire healthcare system rewards what we call innovation. And innovation is defined often by a new product, something that is maybe better or may not be better, but it provides some type of perceived benefit. And because our GDP, we're almost at pushing 20% or something, is related to healthcare, you can see where this idea of especially new products and new things that serve and have not yet been proven to be beneficial still might be looking very fancy and new. And so I do play, I think, is a big role for self-education and educating our leaders how these things can actually implement and what they actually cannot do.
That definitely speaks to me. Just first of all, when you talk about the two extremes, we do have that in military ethics, certainly, and it's expressed generally as the robots or tech will save us all side versus robots or tech will kill us all, kind of the Skynet worry at the other extreme. Those definitely are out there. But this idea of innovation being rewarded always, whether it's good or bad innovation or whether it's been thought through in these ways, that is extremely important and very, very helpful in this conversation, because I think in all of these fields, what you find is this magnet towards the shiny, as you were describing, and while most of us wouldn't be here if we were anti-tech, we're not trying to put genies back in bottles. We're for innovation, but it always has to have these boundaries and these questions and these nuanced reflections in order to make sure that it's used in an ethical manner. And I thank you for bringing that point out. Let me go in kind of a similar thread there, following this along, and ask a question to you, Kijun. Do you think that AI systems and other advanced technology will ultimately produce entities that are superior to human beings? And I'm curious why or why not. I would like to know if you think it's helpful for us to think of robots as mere tools, just the latest tools that humans have invented to make lives easier. Because we know from the beginning, humans have made tools to try to improve our lives. Or does that fail to capture something unique about what robots could be in the future? I mean, we've all seen science fiction shows. Could they ever be less like tools and more like persons?
Sure. So robots are not mere tools. So I call my robots my babies. So one of my robots is, the name of the robot is Woody, and my daughter often ask me when does Woody come home?
Oh, my goodness.
Because I told her that when it's ready, I'm gonna bring him home, and then she is saying she's waiting for her little brother. So maybe my opinion is a little bit biased. So it's certainly not mere tools, but it's not humans either. Whether they're going to be superior to humans, they're already superior to humans in many tasks. They can calculate things much faster. They can process information of certain types much more efficiently than humans. But they're not as ubiquitous or adaptable or flexible as human beings. They're not creative. I can create my own machines and new mechanisms that can generate something new, but current AI cannot. So there are huge gaps, but we should not actually compare human beings to robots. So robots are, I would even consider, it's kind of a part of our environment, not the humans. So as in the old days, humans started kind of making farms and building streets and those things, they started making the changes in the environment. Now we are entering to the new types of environment, new types of built environment that is more dynamic and they can handle information differently. So in order to live in a certain environment, you have certain amount of information to be processed by the humans. Now that is shared by the environment. So you build the streets because now instead of handling all those uncertainties on the streets, you make the streets, so you change the actual environment to handle certain types of information for you. So you build the cars that can be more efficient. So in the same way that AI will do something for humans, although there will be always, we cannot prevent people using AI for bad purposes, unethical use, but that is also, it's our homework too, to work together. But I think robots will be a different kinds of entities, not something that we need to compare with humans. It's something that is there. We built our environment in a more intelligent and more smarter way, in a smarter ways that can help us to live in a better life.
I find that very helpful, that imagery with the environment. On a more comical note, though, I have to say I now want to meet Woody too. So you've sold this. But I also am reminded of how there have been stories, I don't know if you encountered any of this, but of troops actually holding funerals for robots that were in service with them that, for example, had been helping to detect IEDs and other threats to them. And so when they were finally blown up, they genuinely felt a sense of loss. They felt like, something that had been there like a friend, keeping them safe, was now gone. And I named my car, but
I was going to say I felt the same way when my car died. My old blue Volvo.
So we have a history of bonding with this, but this idea of the environment and how we change it and how it changes us and how we interact with it. I love the dynamism of that too, that's not one way either, that it's going to flow both directions. I think that's a very, very helpful imagery. So many great ideas. I hope you're all probably like, when is she going to stop talking? Let us ask questions. We're getting there. I have one more for Margaret, and then one more for the whole panel, and then it's up to you. So be ready. I will be releasing you in a moment for your questions. So Margaret, this one's to you. We know that people sometimes make bad decisions. Shocking revelation. Because they lose perspective, particularly under great stress. Could we actually use AI systems to serve as ethical assistants, like having an automated conscience, reminding us to take the ethical dimensions of our actions into account, like a robo-chaplain, as it were? I'm becoming a robo-ethicist, obviously. So
I have to tell you, I have a visceral reaction, negative, to the phrase robo-chaplain.
Good to know. Good to know.
You could nuance it and call it a chatbot, and it still wouldn't get any better. Partly because it robs the value of what not just chaplains or clergy in general bring to a person, but what they also bring to a community and to a situation. So to take it away from the generic picture, let's talk about the possibilities to what you're after. And that is that there are some situations, certain situations, even life-threatening, which can be predicted. And there are certain human reactions which can also be predicted. So with enough input, artificial intelligence could be programmed to advise on. One could even use artificial intelligence to develop training modules for situation response, for critical thinking opportunities, and then to evaluate that individual response or the unit response to those situations. I think you could definitely use artificial intelligence in that regard, in this scenario. But you could also use artificial intelligence to stimulate those scenarios more realistically. In other words, to enhance a training scenario exercise and to enhance deployment workups, to enable individuals to acclimate and adapt to a volatile environment. In other words, AI is creating all the pieces that create an environment in a benign situation, but to get the individual to have a sense of all the kinetic elements that are a part of that particular situation. In fact, we're already using that. The element to this is that it enables an individual to create the muscle memory for more objective ethical behavior, to be able to set aside their own visceral responses and to be able to respond kind of in a more patterned idea. You used the phrase in one of your articles, and Lisa Lindsay's in here too, she co-authored this. There was a phrase you talked about, could AI do moral de-skilling?
Yep.
Well, I actually think you could use AI to skill in this regard. In other words, you're creating the environment using AI to simulate what's going on in some of these environments with a controlled environment, with the operative word there being controlled. And so that leaves, but if you were to do that, one would want to leave, and this is how we've been using it in military environments, one would leave room for human interaction and input. Right? Thus allowing the unprogrammed but just as right response. One will assume that AI is providing only the right response, right? But if, in fact, in this training scenario, In this exercise, you find that humans are responding differently than the way AI expected them to. You could actually evaluate that response as well. But to use AI in a dynamic, life-threatening situation, that is fraught with limitations. And the limitations fall along the lines of assuming your question implies that AI could advise in the moment. The elements of ethical behavior necessarily include the programmed value bias that we've been talking about already. If this is the situation that you find yourself in, it's live action, and you have AI standing beside you to advise you, one would want to be aware of what that bias is. Well, the bias may be is limited in as much as it has no idea how dynamic this situation is. Oh, by the way, humans are involved in the situation, and humans are complicated, and so is human reaction, and so is the climate in which you find yourself.
We are chaos generators.
Precisely. But even if AI were able to advise human behavior in the thick of the fog of war, even if AI could come up with the right answer with enough deep learning and all the elements that have been programmed into artificial intelligence, based on whatever preset and pure ethical principles it's been programmed with, I'm most concerned that regardless of the outcome, good or bad, an individual may say, AI made me do it.
Accountability.
But the other part of it is that what is the individual left with? If the artificial intelligent advisor gives them advice that morally the individual is at dissonance with, what is that person left with initially at that moment? How does that paralyze them at the moment? But as we have seen time and again throughout battlefield, whether you want to call it post-traumatic stress or battlefield fatigue, there is a moral implication. There is, in fact, moral injury that takes place when some of these things are executed.
I'm so glad you brought in this idea of moral injury, because it is so central to all of these conversations, and it is often understood in part as being the result of feeling betrayed by an authority. And if that authority is a programmed authority, you would still feel this and feel that you perhaps should have known better than to listen to the AI in that situation, and it might actually magnify that injury. Let me do a quick check. Please raise your hand if you think you have a question to ask. Let's see how many. Okay, you know what? I'm going to skip my last question so that we can get some of these rolling. Now, one of our students, Jacob Sandstrom, is over there with a microphone. So I'm going to have him run the microphone to folks. You want to get right over here first, and then. And again, if you want to give your attribution, you can. You don't have to, just an opportunity.
Hi, I'm Sharona Hoffman. I'm a professor of law and bioethics at the law school here at Case Western. And this is for Susana. You talked a lot, I guess all of you talked a lot about AI assisting in doing things currently, surgery, diagnosis, and so on. But AI is also used for predictive purposes, and I think that's a little bit different and raises some other concerns such as discrimination and loss of opportunities and so on. So I'm just wondering if you have any comments on predictive artificial intelligence in the health context.
So the way I understand, I'm not a technologist, but the way I understand AI is that it's all predictive. The idea is that you don't necessarily know the outcome, and it's designed to essentially take hopefully large amounts of data to be able to anticipate and provide options depending on what the tool is made for. So if we go back to healthcare, the whole idea here is that, for example, if we link up our Fitbits and everything else, our Apple Watches and everything else that's, not even healthcare data, we think about social media, we can think about all of these data sources that might be able to provide, even food insecurity in certain neighborhoods, right? So we can use these data that are not even necessarily attributable to an individual person, but perhaps attributable to multiple different aspects. And so the idea is that we could absolutely start to think about anticipating these things in the future, right? The time horizon actually depends on the question that we're asking. And so when I mentioned healthcare allocation, I didn't literally only mean right this very second. We also think about healthcare allocation in terms of future states, right? So we also can look at how disease progresses, and we might be able to anticipate that future needs for various populations might grow that we might not anticipate currently with our current capabilities. So as we start to think about this, I was focusing a little bit more in healthcare ethics in the immediate sense, but my background is actually in justice and in healthcare allocation. And so when we think about these things, it's not just the in the moment. You know, my colleague Hillary Mabel is here, who's a clinical bioethicist at I almost said Sloan Kettering, at Cleveland Clinic. And, you know, I could see the, you know, algorithms and training being applicable to the clinical environment. But I also think it's quite fascinating to think of how we might consider issues of justice and planning in the future, too. So, and how we think of theories of justice and how we might be able to use these data to actually achieve perhaps something that we see as more fair or a better system. And right now, that we're not necessarily using all the data sources we possibly can to achieve that outcome.
Next question, Jacob. Right there, and then right in front of, if you could pass it to her when you're in front of you in the red sweater when you're done. Yeah.
Sure.
Just keep
Hi,
it
my
flowing.
name is John Whitney. I'm an AI programmer. I think that technology, it typically has lots of different problems. Lots of technology can be used for military applications. This is for anyone who wants to address it. What is a pet ethical concern that you think applies to AI specifically, different from other technologies, and what would be the type of safeguard that you would like to see in place to deal with that?
Anyone want to tackle that?
Yeah, I'll start. So maybe because I think just it depending on who are the users. So and then like the ethical mind of that user actually determines the ethical use of the technology as well. So at the level of AI, so I think one of the question related to this panel discussion was whether we could be able to actually implement some safety features that will prevent from the unethical use of the technology. So that is, at the current level, I don't think it is feasible, but I think it is possible in the future. So when the AI starts kind of advancing and then the actual system itself has a built-in features. So if some kind of, the odd behavior is detected, then you can actually block the system or kind of block the user or something like that. I know there is a very limited level that kind of features is already implemented in some online systems or the online behaviors, but it's not in all AI systems. So for instance, if you develop new algorithms and new AI systems that can be used for different robotic systems, depending on who uses it, there's no way you can actually block them use it for unethical uses. So I think that was more of the kind of question from my side as well. So probably I will give it to you.
Well, yeah, and I will just add that unfortunately we have some examples. We gave a few, but there's many examples of AI just amplifying what is not so great about people. Now, I think you can say that about most tech, about any tool. I can take a pencil or a fork and kill somebody with it. So, it's not the thing that has the moral value. It's how I use it. I think that's absolutely valid. But I think any new tech, we want to say, as we have been, is there a way to make it a little safer or not? And we will relate to it differently, whether it is capable of being safeguarded or not. Doesn't mean we won't use it, but we need to be aware of what it is or isn't capable of. Did either of you wanted to add?
I would like to add to that. I think part of it too is that aside from the machinery, if you will, and the unintended consequences of how a machine can take something forward, I think the challenge that I find in our culture today is that we've lost the ability to communicate well with each other.
This
And-
panel being obvious evidence to the contrary, but nevertheless.
But and you can take it back to all we do, you watch kids break up on texts, right? But if we've lost the ability to communicate with each other as human beings, then we will also have lost the muscle memory of how to program communication into systems. And if we've lost the ability to communicate what our intent is and what our values are, and then we don't know what we're going to end up with unintentionally in the machinery. So interestingly enough, MIT has started a study to see if we could start talking about morality, technical morality, in the middle school. So that when kids are learning programming language at the onset, that they're beginning to talk about things that not just how do I add things together, how do I make this goal happen, but the why behind it and the consequences that are behind it and the value set that contributes to that dialogue. So that's where my thoughts are.
I find that very helpful too, the idea of focusing people's attention on who is affected by everything that you do. And again, can you modify it in any way to keep people safer? Did you have anything you wanted?
I'd like to hear another question.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Good point. We have so many. Go right ahead.
My name is Hillary Mabel. I'm a clinical ethicist at Cleveland Clinic. And I want to actually push the safeguard question a little bit further. So we talked a little bit about building sort of safety or safeguards into the technology itself, and even sort of training or ethics education around how it should be used. And I want to ask, we've been talking a lot about sort of AI and warfare, which I think is a very stark example of the harms that can come from AI. But there are probably a lot more everyday sorts of harms that we might think about: privacy issues, trickery or disrupting civil discourse, different things that AI could do that could be harmful, right? And so I want to ask, what is your perspective from the panelists on regulation, for example, what that should look like, and who should be at the table in terms of setting the agenda on something like that?
Another great question. Who wants to go first?
Well, I would say that at least in healthcare, the way I understand the way AI is being deployed is that currently it's not in a systematic way. There are a lot of AI, I'm looking at my AI technologist here, expert. So there's in healthcare, I went to HIMSS conference, which is one of the largest conferences in the United States. It focuses on health and information technology. And what I found was interesting is that even over the course of the previous year's conference is just the pop-up of AI pretty much everywhere. And why this is relevant is that there seems to be a deployment of AI in whatever form it may be into various microsystems within the healthcare industry. And what I see is happening is there's not necessarily a thought-out process on this. And there's certainly, to my knowledge, there's no standard that this is actually regulated by really anybody, right? And so mostly it's not even research. So it doesn't even fall under IRB, which is where we think of human subjects research being evaluated. And so there has been a call at every level for increased regulation. I also think that the organizations themselves hold some responsibility for this, if not a lot. Organizations themselves haven't really thought through how they're actually deploying many technologies, including AI and many other computing capabilities. And so where I see this going is I don't think regulation is necessarily going to be an answer. And I look to the folks who know more than I do on this because it never is going to necessarily keep up. But where I do see a play that's really important is how we put those people at the table. And what my answer is going to be in healthcare is that we have very few, an underrepresented, very important stakeholder voice of the patients, of family, of clinicians that are not necessarily physicians. We also have the community that we have religious leaders, we have other folks that are politicians, we have people that are at the table, journalists. There's so many other stakeholders that bring so much to this perspective. And I don't know if this is actually specific to AI. I think this has to do with a lot of other technologies as well.
I think you're spot on. And I think from the control perspective, one needs to keep an eye on it. The challenge with regulation is that it becomes then law. Well, just because it's legal doesn't mean it's right. And frankly, just because it's right doesn't mean it's kind. And I think I'm back to the virtue piece of this. And so when you talk about things at the table, I think you have to have elements of all of those arenas, as was already articulated. You need to be able to talk about the people who can control the language, the people who understand what the rightness of the intent is, but also the virtue of what is intended.
Nicely stated.
Absolutely. Where's our mic? Oh, Jacob. Can you come all the way up here first, and then we'll go over here so here and then here. And then right across, if you could, when you're done, Sammy, if you could pass it back that direction.
Tony Jack, I'm another
Yep.
criminal for philosophy.
Is it? Hang on. Try it again.
Right, Tony Jack from philosophy, I won't say that. So I wanted to pick up on the themes of automation bias and can we code morality. So in the classic trolley problem of the fat man on the bridge, it's very easy for anyone to articulate, and my students can regularly do it, why you should push the fat man, right? It's a matter of simple math, and most case students at least know that much. But it's much harder to articulate why you shouldn't push the fat man, even though every civilized legal system says it's illegal, and it seems to be a clear human rights violation. So, we know that more empathic people are more inclined towards not pushing the fat man, and more analytic thinking makes you go towards pushing the fat man. And of course, ethicists, the whole trolley problem came up because ethicists don't all agree. So my question is sort of...
Wait, we don't?
Oh, yeah. No, I agree with you.
Good, I agree.
Okay. So my question is sort of like a creeping effect I'm worried about AI. Some types of morality look pretty easy to code. I mean, utilitarianism looks perfectly suited for coded morality, right? Deontological principles, woof. Okay, well, good luck. Values... And so
virtue ethics.
Right. Yeah. Values, virtue. Right. Explaining what a virtue or a value is doesn't look like something that, maybe Dr. Lee will contradict this. But I guess what I'm asking the panel is, do you think there are particular types of ethical understanding that will will forever evade AI, and therefore is there a concern of a creep? And I guess I'm particularly interested in Dr. Rose's response, because my sense is the reason the clinic has someone who is the head of patient experience is because they realize that the kind of utilitarian thinking that drives a lot of medicine leaves out something, which is something like human experience. So I wonder if that's one thing that might get left out of the AI equation.
So the way I'm understanding your argument/question is that you're asking whether there are certain types of ethical frameworks, for example, or theories that might be more amenable to programming. I don't think that's the case, because yes, you're right. On a first blush, utilitarianism might be able to, but you're a philosopher, right? So these ideas about utilitarianism, you start digging in, and things get quite complicated pretty quickly, right? If we're just looking at very simple calculations of saving life versus not saving life, perhaps. But I think that, as I mentioned before, there's, I think very nicely with the idea of value, is that these endpoints are not necessarily so clean cut, which you're right, it brings into the idea of the patient and the patient's perspectives and values. So I don't know if one theory is going to be more amenable for programming than the other. I do not know the answer to your question in terms of can we actually have I think my panelists might be more suited to answer this question. In terms of how we can actually start to imagine ethical decision-making being programmed. I'm not so sure that it's contrary or not impossible, right? We do, I would love to be able to, we have a database that has, I don't even know how many cases now at Cleveland Clinic of over a decade of clinical cases that we have gone through and evaluated in our bioethics department. it would be fascinating to go through and look at these data in terms of the outcome, the recommendation, and on how this might be married up with AI technologies, right? And I don't know. There could be some unearthing of consistency that we might not completely be aware of even. And I would actually be fascinated to see if that happens. In terms of technological capabilities, I don't think we're there yet. And I think you said that right now the programming of more ingrained ethical theory is certainly not the current standard of the technology.
Right. I think it's just the challenges in technology. Like as an engineer, the challenges are in the humans' kind of opinions or humans' judgments, ethics, like what is ethical and what is unethical. Even we do not have a clear cut. So those things are the challenging components. Like, when you think about what is good and bad, and then if, for instance, one of the specific example, when we develop a sociable robot, you want to have the robot to understand humans' emotions. So that is one of the very challenging questions. The robot we train a tremendous amount of data that is labeled by humans, saying that this data set is happy face, this data set is neutral face, this data set is sad. And then we train it, and then the system can automatically determine, okay, that the person interacting with the robot is happy face for a while, and when the robot does something, it's sad and upset or something like that. Even that level of the human behavior is so complicated for our current status of the technologies to understand. Then when you think about ethics, it's much higher level complexity. It's not because of we do not have the technologies. We have the technology or AI that can handle so large amount of data. But the thing is, who determines what is ethical? Something is ethical in this country is not ethical in some other countries. The technology, the people's preference or individual differences plays a role too. So there are so many questions, and it's more of a fluid, not a very solid. So that makes AI to adopt those human notions into the system becomes more difficult and complicated.
And I would just add on that point that even internationally across cultural differences, ethicists may agree on some very core principles, and I would argue that they often do, and so do cultures themselves agree on some core principles. But then again, the expression of that and how that plays out in practice, it gets incredibly nuanced and complicated. You're absolutely right about that. Did you want to add from your...
I think the only thing I would do is underscore something that Dr. Lee said earlier. The mechanical engineer indicated that the one things that humans have that machines don't is creativity. And I think one also finds creativity in ethical decision-making and ethical response. And so we will never, ever, and I can say this unequivocally, lose our creative and virtue inclination. I do not think that that machinery can outpace us in that regard.
Thank you. Sammy. And then when you're done, if you could pass it over to the gentleman over there. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your expertise today. I'm Sammy. I'm an MPH student here at CASE.
And what else are you, Sammy?
I'm also the president of Global Ethical Leaders Society here at the Inamori Ethics Center.
Thank you.
And so I kind of wanted to preface my question a little bit. Dr. Rose, you talked about the ability for AI to simulate or even replace the role of medical providers on an individual level. I kind of wanted to ask more about healthcare decision making on an organizational level, serving populations. So what about hospital administrators, board members of health centers, or even healthcare policymakers? The ability of AI to consider the needs and characteristics of a population, pulling in all this data, and like Dr. Lee said, being able to have that superior capacity to make these complex calculations. Incorporating the interests of stakeholders, considering health disparities, like you said. In a lot of these decision making processes, you're looking at tons of pros and cons, but may not be able to quantify all of these. So for these board members that are making these decisions, could AI have an impact, or are they already potentially using AI to make these organizational level management decisions? And if so, how effective are they? And then, sorry, this is kind of a second part question too, but Admiral Kibun, you also touched on the topic of accountability. So if AI if we were to use AI systems to make these kinds of large-scale decisions, who would be liable if this had like a negative impact on a subset of a population? Sorry, it's a lot.
So I think one thing, I actually have no idea if hospital administrators are using AI. I suspect not right now. I think where healthcare generally is applying these technologies is generally in the diagnostic area right now, and somewhat in the population's health area, right? But it's possible, as I said before, that it could play a very important role, particularly when we look at allocation and decision making across an entire system or systems, where I think there's actually a potential for this idea of augmented intelligence, which I think kind of goes back to the question we talked about before, is I think about my role as a bioethicist in a hospital, and I'm not even sure necessarily if I'm consistent across my own self in situations, and I cannot get inside of the heads of my colleagues. So what I am curious about with AI and other types of situations like this, especially if we can quantify in some way some of these issues that we currently don't quantify, is perhaps with assistance, with we use some kind of augmented intelligence that might help us be more consistent, right? Back to the idea of like, well, Susana, maybe you don't agree with Hillary and her, right? And maybe even these nudges, right, that potentially, if they're done in the right ways, might make us more consistent if we value consistency across similar situations. And so you might see perhaps, in many ways, the structuring as being even helpful in those individual decisions. I am really a skeptic of AI in certain areas, and I have not seen head-to-head trials on a very, very few scenarios in healthcare. I should make that very clear. And where I'm a researcher, and so until I start to see how the counterfactuals, if I start to see randomized trials, if I want to actually see how administrators make decisions with and without. Because even though we say that 30% of the time we're able to prevent a stroke by using the system, well, how does it compare to before? Could the patient actually know the symptoms? I mean, were they actually better than somebody telling them go to the ER? We actually don't look at this. Human judgment might be better in some cases, and it might be worse, but we just don't know that because we haven't analyzed it, certainly at the hospital administrator level, unless somebody can correct me on that one.
Margaret, did you want to add comments on the accountability issue?
I really appreciate you raising the question about accountability, because I've talked a little bit about the accountability in the programming piece of it and the coding part of it, and that we want to make sure we're holding ourselves accountable to some sort of moral code. But I also think we need to make sure that we are maintaining our accountability to the execution and the utilization of artificial intelligence. I think we sort of launch it out there and say, bright, shiny penny, it's going to work, there we go. But I think Dr. Rose's point's well taken and really speaks clearly to this idea of accountability. How do we know? And how do we make sure that we're tweaking it in such a way that it improves and doesn't harm?
And that reminds me back to, again, Kijun's point earlier about how you can't control who is going to take, once you create certain systems, people can take that potential. As someone, again, who works in military ethics, one of the things we often have to face is that even technology that was invented and does have some safeguards in one area, it leaks, into other fields. So something you created in one way gets adopted elsewhere, and that is almost an organic process that you can't really put the brakes on. And I guess I said genie out of the bottle. Right here, sir.
Hi, I'm Andy Podgorski. I'm a computer science professor here at Case. I was happy to hear Dr. Rose use the word skepticism in relation to AI. And I wonder if we'd be better served as a society if we were a little more skeptical about it. Because when we talk about AI as if it were close to accomplishing human intelligence, I think we mystify it. And from the standpoint of most people, a better model for the way AI works today, rather than the human mind, is statistical pattern recognition. And to understand its strengths and weaknesses, you're probably better off focusing on things like sample size
and we can't get the bias out of that either, or we have had a lot of issues with bias.
Right. The same sort of issues that statisticians worry about are huge issues in machine learning. And another thing to bear in mind is that my colleagues in artificial intelligence have been very good marketers over the years. And since I was a graduate student, I've had to tip my hat for their marketing genius. And for instance, the term deep learning was a renaming of something that's been around for 40 or more years. And it really captured the imagination of the public. But it's the same thing that was there 40 years ago. Certainly there have been improvements in the technology, and there's some impressive achievements. I don't mean to diminish it entirely, but it's not really close to human intelligence.
I mean, thank you. I appreciate that so much in particular because one thing that I've argued, and it sounds tongue in cheek, but actually I'm dead serious, is that rather than seeing it as an arms race in the we have to beat Russia and China to the development of AI, I've argued let them do it first. The old saying, it's the second mouse that gets the cheese. If we let them rush to deploy systems that can't do what they've been said that they've been sold that they can do, it becomes a weakness for them that we can exploit. So from that point of view, the skepticism is not only healthy, it's strategic and ultimately ethical if we keep to just war tradition, hopefully. Kijun, would you like to comment any further on some of these questions of potential?
Sure, I actually totally agree that AI is not something that we have to compare ourselves. It's which one is more superior than the other one. It's just the entity. It's a technology that we want to use it in a good way and in a helpful way to do more good than harm. So it's not something we are not in danger of losing our human beings because of AI. AI will be a part of our life, part of our environment. We want to continue to improve our environment to make us to live in a better life. So that was I totally agree with the question.
Susana.
I think some days I'm sold, and some days I'm more skeptical, and I think I'm vacillating between the two, right? So, and I think that's how it is in healthcare as well with many technologies. Many of them have actually been around for quite a while, but then they're deployed and used in a much wider ways and in ways that originally were not necessarily intended. And that's where we get into some really fascinating areas in healthcare. I also, from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's not necessarily some of the new technology, those systems, but it's actually the access of data and data availability. And so that's where I also see, and I think Hillary brought this up, is in terms of data security and other issues. We didn't really touch on that here, but I think that there's fascinating issues with regard to that, particularly because the computing capabilities are getting so much better and faster and bigger. And especially as we, no pun intended, bleed out to other areas. I guess I could hold for healthcare and sadly, for war. Where you have these other data sources that in healthcare we have, HIPAA, we have other regulations that, put some protections around data going out. But there's actually fascinating ethical issues of data coming in terms of, are you actually agreeing to let your Fitbit, hook up with our Epic, our EMR records, right? Are we, in terms of healthcare systems, pulling in other data that might be helpful in terms of directing and suggesting care that might be really, really good for people? However, you start to think about where do those boundaries start to take place? And as a society, do we risk violating trust if we don't have some idea around this, right? So I think there's a whole set of issues that are not necessarily specific to AI exactly, but it's because of AI capabilities and the whole process of data acquisition that I think we have some unique challenges.
Excellent. Would you like to comment, AI skeptic or fan?
Yes.
Both.
Was that the last question? No.
That is.
So yes, but I think I'd like to widen the aperture even further. As a person of faith, I believe that we were given the gift of our brains, as well as many other things that we have had the opportunity to use. We've also been given the gift of autonomy, our own autonomy, our own will, our own volition. And with each of our gifts, our skills, our talents, the technologies, all of these things, our autonomy, we were also given responsibility. And the responsibility that we have is to use them for the benefit of creation. So wherever we find ourselves in the mechanics of artificial intelligence, at its creation, at its utilization, at its oversight, we need always to keep our eyes on our responsibility to the benefit of what it is we've been given and how we use it.
And on that note, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and let's thank our panel one more time.